Hello and welcome back to the Rossi Brothers Sports Podcast. My name is John, joined as always by my brother Adam. And today, who are we joined with? Today, who are we joined by, Adam? Wow, great start.
Boom. We're about 1,000. It's all good. Yeah,
Yeah.
we're really excited to be joined by special guest, Mr. Vince Guerrieri. Vince was born and raised in Youngstown, Ohio, and graduated from Bowling Green State University. He is an award-winning writer for the Elyria Chronicle Telegram and Medina Gazette, and has worked for several other newspapers in major cities in the past, including Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. His writing regularly appears in regional and national magazines and online publications, and he is the author of several books about Ohio sports history. Welcome, Vince, and thanks so much for joining us on the podcast.
It's my pleasure. And I got to tell you, out of all the introductions I have gotten, that one's the most recent.
Yeah, super cool, super cool. Well, we pride ourselves in
Yeah.
recency bias here. Wanted to talk a little bit about Youngstown. I mentioned to you before we started recording that I think you're the first guest we've had in the podcast from Youngstown. Our dad is from Youngstown, our grandparents, and yeah, seeing that our dad and grandmother might be like 20% of our listening audience, we better talk a little bit about Youngstown a little bit. So I actually read excellent article that you wrote in Belt magazine about the Kent State shootings. Terrible tragedy back in 1970, you might get to in a second. But in your bio, it mentioned you were born 3 weeks before Black Monday. Um, I was wondering, for our listeners who aren't familiar with Youngstown, they might not be familiar with that is, could you talk a little bit about what Black Monday was and what that meant to the city of Youngstown?
Sure, sure. Youngstown for many, many years was a steel center. There were several mills. There was a big company called Youngstown Sheet and Tube, and they had a couple of mills in Youngstown. U.S. Steel had a mill in Youngstown. Republic Steel had a mill in Youngstown. So basically, if your family, one way or another, probably earned their living from the steel mills.
Hmm.
And then in September of 1977, Youngstown Sheet and Tube, which had been bought about a decade earlier by a conglomerate, excuse me, and that was the era of conglomeration where a bunch of companies bought a bunch of other companies that may not have been relevant to whatever it is that they were doing.
Hmm.
CBS bought the New York Yankees, Golf and Western bought Paramount Pictures, and a steamship line from New Orleans bought Youngstown Sheet and Tube. And
Huh.
that day in 1977, they announced that one of the mills was going to close at the end of the week. This was well before WARN notices. Now, when someplace closes, you get 90 days. You have to give 90 days notice to your employees. And in fact,
Hmm.
Mhm.
what happened in Youngstown was probably one of the reasons that those laws were passed. So basically, thousands of people were thrown out of work at the end of the week.
Wow. So like on a
It,
Monday, they were told on Friday you're out of a job.
yep, pretty much, and
Yeah.
and that's and little by little, all the mills closed down, and a whole lot of associated industries. Hospitals cut beds, schools started closing. People started leaving town because, I mean, what are you going to do if you don't have a job and everybody else
Mhm.
doesn't have a job either?
Right.
So it's
Yeah.
it's kind of been for as far back as I can remember a fairly bleak place. It's really one of those. My cousin, who is a generation older than me, he's my father's first cousin. He said Youngstown was a get tough or die kind of place. And that was true when he was growing up, when things were, let's say, a little more solvent. And then by the time I came along, it was definitely a whole different kind of get tough or die kind of place.
Wow. Well, thanks for that excellent overview. Um, yeah, it seems like maybe, I mean, you talk about the Rust Belt, and there are many Rust Belt cities. And it seems like some other kind of Rust Belt Appalachian Midwest cities there. I'm thinking like even Pittsburgh, for example. I was thinking of as far away as Chicago, maybe Detroit. Like some of those places, it seemed like were big enough to have other industries besides just steel. So even if, there was some um, pretty negative consequence of the steel industry failing, it didn't completely just kill those places. Whereas Youngstown, it seems like it was pretty much just steel. And am I maybe is there any truth in that maybe hit Youngstown a little harder even than some other Rust Belt cities because it was like that was the only thing in town?
You know, before we get to that, I'm really glad you brought up Chicago because a lot of people lose sight of the fact that Chicago was definitely an industrial town as well.
Hmm.
U.S. Steel had a mill in Gary. Actually, Youngstown Sheet and Tube had a mill in the Chicago area as well. So, I mean, this is, there were a lot of industries that had formed around the Great Lakes, and Youngstown, unfortunately, obviously there's still vestiges of that infrastructure in place. There's still a college in town. There's still, some hospitals, although even the hospitals have gone out to the suburbs. Um, there's still some vestiges of some kind of middle class existence, but yeah, I mean, it was decimated. But the line is that the region lost 50,000 jobs in a 5-year span, and that is about 10 or 12,000 of those came directly from the mills closing. And all of
Wow.
the big complexes, because you didn't just have steel workers, you had machinists, you had welders, you had people who worked in what were essentially these huge industrial campuses.
Mhm.
But at the same time, it was a fairly good way to earn a living, and you were able to take on the trappings of a middle class existence. And that supported a lot of other businesses. There were
Yeah.
restaurants, there were department stores downtown, there was an amusement park out on the edge of the South Side. There were all these places that took a body blow as well. And yeah, they haven't been able to kind of climb back up off the canvas. Pittsburgh did really well with meds and eds because they had a very large, they had that infrastructure to fall back on. Cleveland, in a lot of ways, is still trying to find its way. Detroit, in a lot of ways, is still trying to find its way, and Youngstown obviously is still trying to find its way.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm I don't know. I'm kind of curious also talking about like the stuff that's built up around that. Right, like you mentioned, like not just the production of the steel, but then everything that's used for, and almost like a sort of it doesn't sound like they were vertically integrated, but kind of having that sort of pipeline in place. I'm not sure exactly what the question is around that, but I'm also kind of curious about that impacting you if you have any like particular personal memories, kind of surrounding that from your early life.
Well,
Um,
my parents were both nurses, and they went to nursing school in the early 1970s. Before, obviously, because that was one of the things that they did. They told a lot of the people who had lost their jobs in the steel mills, and even people who had like lost their jobs in the mines in the Pittsburgh area and down into West Virginia, retrain in some type of medical profession because there's always a demand, and it's mostly recession proof, which is why my parents got into that line of work. But yeah, my godfather, he worked for U.S. Steel, and eventually he was able to latch on with a job at the Turnpike Commission. But it was kind of lean for a little while, and I had some
mhm,
relatives who packed up and left, and I remember going to school when I was a little kid. And there were people who were there at the beginning of the school year who were not there at the end of the school year. My elementary school, I was supposed to go to West Elementary, at least initially, and they redrew the boundaries after one of the other schools was closed, and I ended up going
mhm,
to Kirkmere instead. So yeah, there were all these ways that it kind of affected you, maybe not even without realizing it. So I
mhm.
mean, it was one of those things that I would say was inescapable even as a kid.
Yeah. Um, you said it's a get tough or die place. I'm curious, are there any specific memories of your growing up time there that makes you say that? Um, Yes.
I mean, nothing really in particular. I mean, I'm not one of those people who's going to say, "Oh yeah, I grew up on the mean streets of Youngstown." At least not seriously. I've said that sometimes, tongue firmly in cheek. But we grew up in what was essentially a middle class neighborhood, and not necessarily. I mean, our fathers weren't necessarily college educated, but it was all still, we were decently fed and decently housed, and but I knew people. You get to meet enough people in Youngstown. You knew people who were able to get out and make something of themselves, and you knew people who, maybe not people. I'm not going to tell you I was close friends with them, but I definitely knew people who did not make it out.
Yeah.
Mhm.
One thing my dad talks a lot about is high school football and how big of a deal that was in Youngstown. I remember where I grew up, John and I grew up in Western Maryland. We had the Fort Hill Allegheny. That was like the big football game every year. And I remember our dad saying, "Yeah, that's nice, but like football in Youngstown was a big deal." Um, I'm curious if you have yeah, recollections of high school football in Youngstown. And specifically, I remember growing up, I was in second grade when Ohio State won the national title, beating Miami in whatever bowl game that was, when they had Maurice Claret.
Fiesta Bowl,
Um,
2002.
yeah, yeah. Do you remember watching Maurice
Mhm.
Claret in high school back in the day?
I do not actually. That Maurice Claret is a little younger than I was, so I
Mhm.
don't remember him. Um, because when he was playing football at Warren Harding, I was in, where was I? I was in Pittsburgh. Yeah, I
Okay.
graduated college in 1999. I got a job in Pittsburgh and I was a news reporter. So, I mean, I wasn't going to, a whole lot of football games or basketball games. I
Okay.
completely, I had heard about this kid from St. Vincent St. Mary's who played basketball, but I never got to see him in high school either.
He was
But
the next guy I was gonna ask you about.
Yeah.
no, I don't remember seeing Maurice Claret. Actually, I probably have stronger memories of people I covered. I was out in Northwest Ohio for a while, and people in the Mahoning Valley take pride in high school football, and rightfully
Mhm.
so. But I feel like that's a point of pride in a lot of places around Ohio. My second book was on the rivalry between Fremont Ross and Sandusky High School football. That is the second longest and second most played rivalry in Ohio high school football.
Wow.
I believe the only one that's
Wow.
older is Massillon and Canton McKinley, and the only one that's been played more is Piqua and Troy. So
Wow.
it
Wow.
is high school football is a big deal all the way around. I went to Fremont in 2005. I got to see Dane Sanzenbacher at Toledo Central Catholic, who obviously played for some Ohio State teams that went to national title games but couldn't quite get over the hump. But obviously, at that point, I was a really big Ohio State fan because of Jim Tressel. Because I do remember when when Jim Tressel was a coach at Youngstown State, and in fact, I tell people that you have to the thing that you have to understand about Jim Tressel is he made growing up in Youngstown in the 1980s a little less bleak. And I don't think a lot of people appreciate how difficult a job that was.
I
Yeah.
yeah, fond memories of watching on VHS tape the national championship. They won a few. I think it was maybe 93, but I remember watching that in our living room when one time definitely John when Grandma and Grandpa came. I remember watching
Uh-huh.
the one national championship that Youngstown State won.
Wow.
And
Okay.
it was just recorded from the TV.
Yeah.
But
Man,
yeah,
fun.
well, if I
That
ever
might be a
have
VHS that was still in our basement somewhere. I'm pretty
I'm sure
sure
yeah.
I found one
Yeah,
time going through. Anyway.
it's great. I
Sorry.
man, if I'm ever on like an Ohio sports trivia contest and I need a lifeline, I'm gonna keep your your exactly. You're the one I'm gonna call, Vince. You you
Yeah,
seem to know your
absolutely.
stuff. Yeah.
I was
Still can't
I'm
get on
curious.
Jeopardy.
Um yeah, so again, sorry about the preamble with that, but yeah, is there some loss of some of those rivalries or mergers or other things that have happened that have affected that like high school football atmosphere?
Yeah, there really has. Here in Elyria, the big rivalry was Elyria and Lorraine High School. And it's really interesting because in the post-war era, both school districts expanded. Elyria added a second high school, Elyria West, and Lorraine at one point had three public high schools: Lorraine, Admiral King, and Southview. And Lorraine is actually a city that's a lot like Youngstown. There was a lot of immigration there, and it seems like every ethnic group has their own church, their own funeral home, and their own social club. And
Mhm.
a lot of the industries dried up. The steel mill there has been closed for a while. The shipbuilding yards are now like a banquet center and a microbrewery, but they don't actually build ships there no more. And
Mhm.
one by one, all of these schools closed. Elyria West closed. Um, Lorraine Southview closed, and Lorraine Admiral King closed. I should say that Lorraine Southview and Lorraine Admiral King aren't high schools anymore. I believe they're both junior highs now. But there are two high schools, Lorraine and Elyria, and it's kind of the same, but it's not quite the same, I guess is the best way to put it. It was
Uh-huh.
uh, old timers like to talk about the pitched battles when they were kids, and I'm sure that there are 20-year-olds who roll their eyes at the things I say because that's kind of how the world works. But
Yep.
um,
Uphill both ways, right?
right in the
Yeah.
snow.
Exactly.
But
Kind of sounds a little bit. I went to West Virginia University, and
okay.
it kind of sounds a little bit about like what happened with the West Virginia Pitt rivalry, because that was an
Oh,
awesome
sure.
rivalry.
It really was. I
Um,
can remember it would have been 04, I think. I was working at the Trib, and Pitt Stadium was gone by then, so they were playing at Heinz Field, which was
nice
right
field.
across the street. And it
Mhm.
was just absolutely nuts that night.
Yeah,
It was absolutely frigid, and everybody there was just out of their minds.
yeah. That
It
was
was.
a
It was a very heated rivalry.
For sure. It was a fun
Mhm.
series. And I guess I'm thinking mostly about like because they played in all sports. I'm thinking about men's college basketball. And in those latter days when they were both in the Big East, I really enjoyed some of those matchups. But and then of course they switched conferences, didn't play for a while, and then they started playing. It's been maybe 6, 7 years now they've been playing in men's college basketball. And it's fun, but it's not anywhere near the same that it was when they were in the same conference. Whenever you said those high school rivalries are similar but different, that's the first thing that came to mind.
And that's
Mhm.
those Big East basketball tournaments at that point and around that same time were fantastic because you had Jim Calhoun and UConn in all of their glory. Obviously, Boeheim was at Syracuse in all of his glory,
Hmm.
and Jamie Dixon was at Pitt, and I think it was still Beeline at that point who was yet at WVU.
Yeah, there's some
That's
good
right.
battles
Yeah.
there.
Hmm.
Yeah. Um,
Yeah. Super. Mhm.
mention all these
And the
sports.
toughest ticket in town at that point was trying to get into the Peterson Events Center for a Pitt basketball game.
Oh
Because
yeah.
that was the thing. The
Really?
Penguins were
Mm.
good, but they were never good enough that it was a hard ticket. And the Steelers were the same way. If you knew somebody, you could get into a Steelers game. But I mean, those ones, the Pitt basketball for a couple of years there was probably the toughest ticket in town.
Huh. Huh.
Wow.
Noticed you didn't mention the Pirates. Not too tough to get a Pirates ticket,
The
I'm sure.
Pirates were the toughest ticket for that opening day, that first opening day at PNC Park, and then it was like when I was a kid and I watched the Indians on Channel 43, the announcers would say, "Plenty of good seats still available."
I think we can both relate. John's a
Yeah.
John's a big Pirates fan. Hey,
Yeah.
as we speak
Exactly.
right
Saddest
now,
thing I've heard today.
the Pirates and the Royals both have winning records right now. That hasn't been true for a very long time, so that's
Yeah. I
kind of
needed. I
exciting
needed to
as
like
we
save
record.
a screenshot on my phone of when before they'd lost a game, and I was like, "Wow, the Pirates are like 4-0. Let's enjoy it while it lasts, right?" Uh,
Yeah. Vince, did you play sports yourself growing up in Youngstown?
As a kid, I did. I didn't play any sports in high school. I kind of realized my own athletic limitations fairly early on. I said, you know what? I can't play sports, but I think I can write about. So,
Okay.
that was kind of the way I got to scratch the itch. And honestly, I've been fortunate enough to have made a career of it.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Did you,
What
how early on did you get started? So you said in high school you were no longer playing sports.
Yeah.
Were you thinking about writing about sports at that time? Did you do anything like amateurly, or was there something in high school that you worked on?
I mean, I worked on the school paper in high school, but it didn't
Mhm.
really start getting moving um, until college. I said I want to go to journalism school. I went to Bowling Green, which at the time there were, I believe, four schools in Ohio that had a 5 days a week student newspaper. And
mm,
Bowling Green made me
wow.
the proverbial offer I couldn't refuse. I ended up there. I started working at the paper pretty much the day classes started my freshman year, and I
Nice.
haven't looked back since.
Well,
Wow. That's impressive. You're like, no, no, you have a thought, you want to carry it out and you pursue it, right? Like you say, pretty much the day you got there. That's awesome.
And it's mostly worked
Kudos to
out.
you. Yeah. Seems like it.
I at the end of your kind of afterward in weird moments in Cleveland sports history, which I read and really enjoyed, you mentioned that started out on Twitter, just people
Yes.
mentioning weird things about Cleveland sports on Twitter. Um, I'm guessing your writing process usually doesn't happen, isn't inspired necessarily by Twitter. Could you talk a little bit about like what your process is like and how you come up with a story and how you go about writing it?
Well, it's really interesting. I started out in newspapers, and newspapers, there's still a lot of adherence to what's called the inverted pyramid style of writing, in that you have the most important details at the top, and then gradually you get down into, more and more details. It's actually a remnant of the days of like the Civil War when stories were transmitted by telegraph wires, and you
Mm,
wanted to put the most important stuff first before the wires potentially got cut because there were storms and it was a war and there was all kinds of things going on.
mm,
But um, in the last 10 years or so, I branched more into some magazine type writing. And it's really kind of a different process for that because you have to know where your story is going to start, where it's going to go, and where it is going to end. In newspapers,
mm,
there's more of an element that you go where the story takes you.
mhm,
So I did that with more, I do more feature type stuff for magazines. You talked about stuff I've written for Belt. Um, and that started out, most of that is freelance stuff, which means that you have to have a fairly well organized pitch. You have to have
mm,
an email that you send to somebody. One of my friends, because when you're a writer, you get to meet every other writer. But one of them said that your that pitch that you write to an editor is your first writing sample for them. So you really have to make it count.
mm,
So
Mhm.
that was kind of a different style of writing for me as well. And then, branching into books, when you write a novel, you have to have a manuscript completed. But when you write a work of nonfiction, I mean, it's like a magazine pitch,
mhm,
You can usually sell them on an outline. Again, you have to know where the book starts, where it's going to go, and where it's going to end, and a sample chapter or two. And that's actually what I did with this book. It was crowdsourced on Twitter, because my friend Chris McNeil, whom you might know if you are on social media yourself, he is the notorious reflog, and
okay,
he started soliciting this, and we kind of got to the point where there really does seem to be an inordinate amount of weird things that have happened in Cleveland sports history. And I thought, well, I could probably get a book out of that. And I assembled a outline and I took it to Gray Publishing. And Gray does a lot of Northeast Ohio nonfiction type stuff. They do a lot of sports stuff. The biography of Joe Thomas that came out last year was a great publication. Jim Ingram, my colleague at the Chronicle, wrote a biography of Mike Hargrove, and that was a great publication. And there are other non-sports type books. Neil Zurcher, who did the one tank trips for Channel 5, his books are out through Gray. Dan Coughlin, who's on Fox 8 now, but was a sports writer for a long time, his books are out through Gray. So I took the outline to them, and they bit, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Well,
speaking of history a little bit, I mean, I think we can get more into that book in particular. But also, I saw some of your magazine articles, like something in like Popular Mechanics. I saw there were a few there as well. And some of them very much not sports related, more like historical. I'm curious, talking about your process and kind of having a story to pitch. How much of that comes from you being interested in the history and like kind of reading stuff more on your own time and realizing, oh, there's this story to tell here, versus looking for something interesting to then write about? Like, or if there's a distinction there, I don't know how much is like just kind of your own personal interest that you then happen upon something, or really kind of seeking out a particular story.
Well, part of it too is knowing where to go, and I spend an inordinate amount of time on Twitter, and I still can't necessarily quit it, because it remains a target-rich environment for journalists. Because when editors, and nobody's found a really good substitute for it, you'll see some stuff on LinkedIn, you never see anything on Facebook, but on Twitter, editors would say, "Hey, I have just got into this new role." That's actually how I pitched my first story to Popular Mechanics. Was an editor from them said, "Hey, I am looking for pitches. This is what I assign stories about. If you got something, hit me up."
Mm-hmm.
And I did. Actually, the first story that I brought to them came out of a story that I did for Ohio Magazine. I do a lot of stuff for Great Lakes Publishing. That's Ohio Magazine, Cleveland Magazine, Lake Erie Living Magazine, but they do some custom publishing and things like that. Most media companies at this point do have some kind of branded content marketing, custom publishing arm that kind of helps them keep the lights on. So I did this story for Ohio Magazine on the 100th anniversary of the Butler Art Institute in Youngstown. And it was one of those places that if you were a kid in Youngstown, you went to. You went there a couple of times while you were in school on a field trip. My mother went back to school when we were kids at Youngstown State, so I would, go through there once in a while. And in fact, when I come home, sometimes I'll still kind of go through there. I really enjoy it. I really appreciate it. And it wasn't until I moved away that I realized how special it was. I thought every city had an art museum like that. So I wrote the story on the centennial of the Butler Art Institute, and we go past an installation by a guy named Nam June Paik. And he did a lot of avant-garde 3D art involving technology and involving televisions. And so he had this installation that was just a wall of these, I would say, about 10-inch TV monitors. And he did this in I think it was the 80s. And they were all cathode ray tube televisions.
Okay.
And it got to the point where the TV started burning out. And cathode ray tube televisions are really hard to come by now. And they went and found some of them on eBay to replace them, but eventually they went, wow, I don't know what to do. And they couldn't ask the artist. He was dead by then. So they said, we don't want to mothball this, so we're going to put in flat screen televisions. And in fact, if you go look at it, you can see that it is convex, because the plastic casings are still convex because they had tubes in them, but there's a little bit of room between the casing and the flat screen TV now.
Huh.
Hmm.
And I thought this is really interesting. And one of the things that you learn as a journalist is, there are certain things, and I thought if it's happening here, it's got to be happening somewhere else. It's got to be happening in a lot of other places, because how many
Mhm.
other museums have installations like this, or on a computer screen, or on something? And I was able to parlay that into a story for Popular Mechanics, and occasionally I get asked what advice I would have for somebody who's going into freelance writing, and I tell them editors are not looking for geniuses. They are not looking for brilliant writers. They'll be happy if they find them, but what they're really looking for is somebody they don't have to worry about. If you are just competent, if you take your edits, if you hit your deadline, if you hit your word count, um, they are usually receptive to whatever your next pitch might be. And sometimes they'll say, "Hey, I got this story that needs written. Why don't you write it for me?" So, that's
Mhm.
kind of how that really comes about. So I have a whole bunch of,
Gotcha.
of places that I've kind of built those kinds of relationships with. And like you said, when something piques my interest, I go, "That's really interesting. I wonder if I can get somebody to pay me to write about it." And
Okay.
sometimes I can, sometimes I
Uh-huh.
can't, but those are the breaks.
Wow.
Um,
That's, I don't know, that's super interesting. A lot of a lot of that whole story, but the Butler Art Institute, I remember I have two memories. One being a kid and going there and seeing there was like a 3D art installation that was like a whole marble like run thing. This is with grandma,
mhm.
and that being like astonishing to me. So I corroborating even kids who did not grow up in Youngstown, uh some of them have memories of the Butler Art Institute. Um but yeah, no, that's super interesting. Is there like a hit or miss rate, I guess I would say, of something that you think might be a story and then can actually uh develop into one?
You mean how often can I land something?
I guess if you something that you have an idea like that, for example, if you see the story of, oh, you're replacing an old cathode ray TV with this flat screen, how often is that happening? And then the answer turns out to be interesting. Um, I don't know, versus something it's like, oh, this seems like this might be interesting. You dig a little deeper and it ends up there's not so much of a story there. Um,
Oh, that happens all the time. I mean, there are certain things that seem interesting on their face, and you dig a little deeper, and you go, "I'm not sure what I can say about this," because that's the thing. The other piece of advice that you get a lot when you're trying to make pitches like this is, you are not writing about a topic, you are writing a story, and that is how your pitch should be tailored. You don't say, "I want to write about heroin addiction." You say, "I want to write about this program in this particular city that has a really high success rate in dealing with heroin addiction." And that's the
mhm,
thing, and like I said, when you're writing a magazine story, you have to have a pretty good sense of where it starts, where it goes, and where it ends.
mhm,
When you mentioned just knowing all these writers, and I'm thinking a sports writer I kind of adore, I guess is fair to say at this point, is Joe Posnanski. I think he's kind of
I think
well
adore is a
known at
good
this
word for
point.
it. Yeah.
Yeah. Have you ever met Posnanski?
I don't know that I know that we've been in reasonably close proximity to each other. I believe we were both at um, LeBron's first game back with the Cavs in 2014, but
Hmm.
I don't know that I have crossed paths with him a whole lot, because most of the stuff I do is, you know occasionally I'll get to a pro sporting event or a big ticket college event, but that's not necessarily my beat per se.
Hmm.
So I don't have a lot of assignments that bring me into those environments.
Who are some of your favorite writers? Who are some of the people that inspired you?
Boy, that's a really good question. I can remember reading, even as a kid, I can remember being just stunned reading Mike Royko. Mike Royko from he was from at one point I think he worked at all the newspapers in Chicago. He did a lot of stuff for the Daily News. He was at the Sun Times, and he ended his career with about a decade at the Tribune. But I just remember reading him. He was one of the guys that had the um, syndicated columnist spot in the Vindicator growing up.
Sure.
So I got to read him regularly, and then I read his biography of Mayor Daley in Chicago.
Hmm.
I think high school age, and it was just amazing. I mean, it felt like a real revelation to me because it was a journalist who was gathering this information in real time and writing about it, and he was getting people to say things that I was just stunned to hear from him. And of course, the other thing is, I mean, we got the Sunday Cleveland Plain Dealer, and I wanted to be, I really wanted to be Bill Livingston. He was one of their regular sports columnists, and I've actually gotten to meet him and talk to him a few times. I'm a member of the Cleveland Press Club, and so
Hmm.
is he. He's retired now from the Plain Dealer, and I actually he wrote a book on the Cleveland Pipers, and the Pipers came up in my book as well. They're an absurd story. There was a lot of, um, there were a lot of basketball leagues that kind of came and went, and this was one of them.
Hmm.
And um, it was George Steinbrenner's first foray into professional sports ownership, and the it was a fiasco. I mean, there's no other way for me to dance around that. It was a fiasco. The team folded. The team actually, its folding dragged the whole league down with them. And the Cleveland Press said afterwards that George Steinbrenner poisoned the well for pro basketball in Cleveland. Obviously, that turned out not
Huh.
to be the case. But I remember reading this book, and I saw Bill at a press club function. I says, "Hey, I read your book," and he says, "Oh, so you're the one." And that's one of those things. I mean, you're always kind of um, pleasantly surprised when people will actually say to you that they read the book. Honestly, I'm just thrilled when people say they bought the book. I don't. At that point, I don't care if they read it or not. They can give it to their father-in-law for Christmas. They can use it to prop up the one wobbly leg on the kitchen table. But I mean, if you bought it, I'm just
You
really
can use it
excited.
as part of your Zoom background, right?
What?
That's the whole thing now is having an impressive looking bookshelf behind you, whether or not you've actually read anything on
Well, and that's the other thing too. When you are a writer, people start sending you books. So
it.
I have a whole variety of books that I have been sent. Sometimes I even got a couple before publication. They said, "Read this, evaluate it, and tell us what you think."
Hmm.
And I'm usually delighted to do that. And thus far, the books I have read have been definitely worth my time.
Nice, excellent. Um, I'm curious also, I think you were mentioning in there about sort of getting answers out of people or sort of getting information that you're surprised people are forthright with, I suppose. Is there a particular um maybe two prongs to this question. Is there a particular art or things that you've learned from other people about interviewing someone or how to get that sort of an answer from someone? And then also kind of going on that, is there someone in particular that you've gotten to interview in the past that stands out to you as like a really interesting or very fun interview?
Sure. The biggest gift you can have is silence. I mean, let them talk because and this was a line in Pulp Fiction. I never forgot it where Uma Thurman talks about uncomfortable silences, and the thing about
Mhm.
uncomfortable silences is that people want to fill them, and sometimes people will start talking, and people will tell you things. And the best thing you can do is to shut up and let them tell you things. But I did a story also for Ohio Magazine on the um, first year of the Cleveland Cavaliers, and that
Mm.
team was dreadful. I mean, they were just terrible. And um, I learned a very important lesson doing that story. And it's, the farther away um, professional athletes get from the game, the chattier they get. I mean, it may be easier to find the guy who is still coaching or the guy who's part of a broadcast team, but it may not be as easy to get in front of them.
Mm.
But a guy who played, pro basketball or pro football for 5 years and is selling insurance now, I mean, he'll talk your ear off. And my editor for the piece said for the Cavs story, it's only going to work if you get everybody. And Campy Russell was not on that team. It was a couple of years before the Cavs got him, but he is the director of the team's alumni society. And he said, I'll get you everybody. And he got me everybody. And they were all thrilled to talk to me.
Wow.
That's an excellent article. I did read that one, and yeah, I learned a lot about the terribleness of the Cavs there early on. Um, which kind of brings us back to Cleveland sports, and as someone who definitely grew up as a Cleveland sports fan, particularly the Browns, but also the Cavs. And I had a soft spot for the Indians. My dad, unfortunately, is a Yankees fan, so I didn't really
Gross.
follow them as closely. Yeah.
Mhm.
But anyway, in terms of Cleveland, the Cavs thankfully got that ring finally a few years back now. But it's been a long, as you very well know, a long difficult ride, I think, for the Tribe, for the Guards, and for the Browns. The Browns won their last titles, I'm sure you all know, in 1964 when Jim Brown was playing, who's now deceased, just before our mother was born. Um, how long do Browns fans have to wait, Vince?
That's a really good question, and I don't have a really good answer for you. Especially since my deepest concern right now is since they came back, the Browns have been good for one winning season a decade, and I'm afraid last year is the last one until the 2030s. I mean, this
Oh
is
boy.
this is a team. I feel like they're in a reasonably good position, but I felt like they were in a reasonably good position after the 2020 season. I felt like they were in a reasonably good position after the 2007 season. I felt like they were in a reasonably good position after the 2002 season. And obviously, none of these have provided anything to build on. So, I mean, I don't know. I really don't. The Browns traded Baker Mayfield because I feel like they realized his limitations. Obviously, if you've been watching pro football, you see there's Patrick Mahomes, there's Josh Allen, there's Joe Burrow, and there is a whole big gap between everybody else, and it's, um, Baker was one of those guys. There are certain things he could do, and there are certain things that he couldn't do. So they dealt him, brought in Deshaun Watson, and I don't want to get too deep into my thoughts on Deshaun Watson, but I will say this: if you make the deal they make to bring him in, you are expecting a very clear upgrade. And to this point, you have not gotten a very clear upgrade. So I don't know when things are going to get better. I don't know if things are going to get better. So I guess we'll see what happens when they go to the Greenbrier again this summer.
Yeah, that's for sure. I remember watching last year, of course, when Flacco came in and had his little renaissance there, and thinking like, man, Flacco somehow is a lot better than Deshaun Watson has ever been with the Browns. And I like totally did not see that coming. I don't think anyone did. Um, but yeah, if you would have told me Joe Flacco is going to be a much more effective quarterback than Deshaun Watson when they signed Watson, I don't think the Browns expected that.
Well,
Um,
that's what I said. I said I want to go back. I said in December, I said I want to go back to the summer and tell people that this season the Browns would have a Super Bowl MVP on their roster and then just laugh maniacally because that, yeah, I mean, I that was the thing when Watson went down. I thought I just don't see him, having any kind of success with DTR and with Walker. I mean, I feel like they could do the job, but I didn't think they could do the job particularly well. But they did it well enough to bring the Browns along until they signed Flacco. And I was kind of stunned that he was the guy that they signed. That they didn't deal for um, Josh Dobbs. That they didn't deal for Jacoby Brissett, or really make any kind of move at the deadline. And then I said, well, either they're rolling with who they got, or there's somebody they think they can sign off the street. And obviously
Mm.
that somebody was Joe Flacco, and it really was stunning, because that's the thing. The performance he had was better than any Browns quarterback had had, and that kind of stretch for years, if not decades. But at the same time, it was a performance that he had not really had anywhere else. I mean,
Mhm.
even when he was with the Ravens were, for everything they were good at, they were not good at bringing in wide receivers. I mean, they always had a big tight end or two, but I mean, their receiving core has always left a lot to be desired. So, I mean, Flacco was doing things that he'd never done before, and he was doing them for the Browns, and they hadn't seen quarterback play like that in years. So yeah, it was kind of stunning. It was kind of fun, but again, this is a quarterback that we knew had some limitations, and boy, we saw him in living color in that playoff game against the Texans.
Ain't that the truth? Yeah, it was a rough game.
Yeah.
It really
Um,
was.
but man, give the Browns fans out there some hope, Vince. What's a hopeful thing they can latch on to?
I mean, this is still a pretty well put together team. I mean, obviously, there are things that they need to do, but we have reached that point where you're looking at a team that has a lot of key talent and even a little depth. I mean, I can't remember the last time the Browns were heading into a draft where they did not have a really glaring need. I mean, their first draft pick, admittedly, isn't until the second round, but I feel like they're at a point where they can take the best player available. You don't say, "Oh, well, we need him to get a wide receiver." I mean, it wouldn't hurt if they were going to take a flyer on a wide receiver. We need some kind of offensive lineman. We need, something. I mean, they've been very judicious in their free agent signings as well, and their trades. I'm still not sold on the extension that they gave Jerry Judy, but I mean, what the hell? It's not my money.
Well,
Yeah.
thanks.
Well, hopefully we'll see the some fruits of the team that they have put in place. Um, or
Yeah,
even
hope they can.
I don't know how you would feel. I think like advancing a round in the playoffs. If that, I mean, that's a lot. Just saying, I don't want to jinx anything. I'm knocking on wood right now. But like, I feel like in sports, oftentimes too, you need to build over consecutive years. Hopefully, they can do something, knocking on all the wood possible. Um, but yeah, even some hope, I suppose.
Well, the try. Sorry, go ahead, Vince. You got to say something?
I mean, the first thing I want to see is I want to see him have a winning record, because the Browns have not had a winning record in back-to-back years since the 80s. I'd like to see them win a division, something
Mhm.
else they haven't done since the 80s.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's been a long wait, but
Mhm.
we'll see. We'll see. It's been a longer wait for the Guardians. Their last World Series title was 1948. I was actually somewhat surprised to find they had three, not just Hall of Fame, but like some of the greatest pitchers ever in that World Series. They played the Boston Braves, who featured Warren Spahn on their
Hmm.
roster, and then the Indians, as they were known at the time, obviously had Satchel Paige and Bob Feller.
And by
But
the way,
anyway, obviously those folks long deceased. I've actually seen Satchel Paige's grave here in Kansas City. But how much longer do Guardians fans have to wait, Vince?
I don't have a really good answer for you on that either, because I mean, the one thing that baseball has going for it, I feel like more than any of the four major sports, is that all you have to do is get there. 9 times out of 10, the better football team is going to win a playoff game. And I feel like 9 times out of 10, the better basketball team or hockey team is going to win a playoff series. But in baseball, I think it depends on, can you get hot at the right time? And we've seen it happen plenty of times. I mean, we've seen
Just last
plenty of
season.
teams.
Yeah, the
Huh?
World Series last year feels like
Yeah,
that.
yeah, that's a really good example. Actually, both those teams.
Hmm.
So I mean, it's a really, really good example. I mean, I can remember that '95 Indians team was an absolute juggernaut. I mean, they took on all comers. The team 2 years later that went to the World Series was not as good, and in fact, was kind of scuffling until about the end of August, and then just got hot all of a sudden, and went to the World Series. So, I mean, I feel like that is the most unpredictable of the sports. I don't have a good answer for you there. I mean, I feel like already there's some bad juju going around. I mean, Shane Bieber is down for the season. And what's really unfortunate about that is I feel like Bieber was very solidly trade bait. I feel like if everything had gone according to plan, he wouldn't even be on the team this year. I think he was ripe for getting dealt before the deadline last year, but he had to go on the shelf. Came back this year and they said, okay, maybe they'll deal him at the deadline this year if they're not in the running, and unfortunately he's out for the rest of this year, and who knows how long for next year. But I feel like the Guardians are fortunate enough to have not a great team, but certainly a good team, and play in the weakest division in Major League Baseball.
Yeah, absolutely. The
Mm.
Royals benefit from that as well. Well, they haven't really benefited in the past.
I was going to say it's been
That's
a while since
Yeah.
they've benefited from it, but yeah.
yeah, reason for hope anyway.
I I don't know. Personally, I think of the 2016 team that that was 2016, right? That went to the World
Yeah, yeah.
Went
Series.
to the World Series, yes.
It was that was the same year that they had the big winning streak too. Yes.
They had a big winning streak. I believe that was the year that they won 14 games. The following year was the year they had the really big winning streak.
Okay.
That was the year that they had the 22 game winning streak, and they rolled into the playoffs. And boy, it was. I mean, I was at game two. That was the one that was in that the Indians won in extras. And then they lost the next three to the Yankees. And I really believe if Aaron Judge was 6 inches shorter, they'd have swept that series. And then, again, who knows what would have happened.
Hmm. Do you see the Guardians kind of building up to a similar team or teams to those couple of years without needing to do kind of a whole rebuild? Or again, I think in baseball you see very commonly with teams that are not the largest market teams that kind of cycle. I'm well familiar with the Pirates. We spent like 3 years being competitive, and then like 8 or 9 years
Once
they
I
were still
got
in.
one
But
of my friends a T-shirt for Christmas, and this would have been, I'd say, 2008, 2009, and it was a shirt that said Pittsburgh, City of Champions, and the Pirates. But
precisely, yeah.
the thing about the Pirates is, and this is probably one of the problems with baseball in general, is that if you are not uh, incentivized to win, you don't necessarily feel the urge to try to win. The
Mhm.
team makes a lot of money even before the first pitch is thrown, and so they don't need to. I remember when they were talking about the draft in Pittsburgh, and they said, the can't miss prospect that year, who as it turns out, I mean, isn't a superstar, but he had a decent major league career, was Matt Wieters, the catcher that was drafted by the Orioles, and they said, oh yeah, the Pirates are in perfect position to take him. They could use a catcher. And the Pirates did not take him because I believe he was a Scott Boras client. And they said, "Oh, we're going to have to spend too much money on this guy." And that was kind of the Pirates' problem,
Mhm.
writ small. Say what you will about the Haslams, I really believe that they want to win. I do not feel that you can make those types of assumptions about the Nuttings.
Mm, mm.
Yeah. Do you think then that Cleveland's gonna hopefully be able to put that into place? I don't, again, not to like prognosticate too much for the future, but at least um without kind of going into the same kind of very long rebuild
I mean, they've been
situation.
really good
Yeah.
at doing that already. I mean, there were a few lean years in the obviously the Indians put together some great teams in the late 90s and early aughts, and then they went into full on teardown mode. And the problem with that is they whiffed on a lot of draft picks. So there were quite a few lean years. In 2007, they obviously won the division and advanced as far as the ALCS, but then there were a bunch of lean years after that too. But I feel like they've got a really good team in place in the front office. I believe that Terry Francona always gave you an advantage. Um,
Mhm.
and so far, I mean, it really sounds like they made a good hire with Stephen Vogt.
Well, I hope for the best this summer. It's a beautiful time of year, beautiful time to be alive with the baseball in the air. So I'm looking forward to a great season here. We'll see what it holds for the Guardians and a lot of other hopefuls out there.
Yeah.
Um, Vince, thank you so much for your time. Want to respect it. Know we're about the end of our time here. Before we get off, wanted to ask you a question we ask everyone at the end of the Ross Brothers Sports podcast, and that is, why are sports important?
I always come back to something that Earl Warren said, the former governor of California, former Chief Justice of the United States. He said, every morning when I read the paper, I turn to the sports section. The front page is full of mankind's failures, and the sports page is full of mankind's successes. And it is, again, it is one of those instances. It is a reflection of who we are, for good or for ill, and at the same time, it is a reflection of the best we can be.
Hmm. Well said,
Wow.
well spoken. Well,
I think
once
that's the
again,
first
thank you so
time
much,
we've
Vince.
oh, I was gonna say it's the first time I think we've had Earl Warren come up on the podcast.
Yes, yes.
So making history every day. But yeah, his words
Lot of
and
firsts.
and your words, yeah. So
Mhm.
sorry, go ahead, Adam.
Yeah, no, really appreciate your time, and yeah, look forward to watching those brownies, those guards, and those Cavs, and I'll be thinking about you when they with a few more W's every time I see him. But
From your
yeah,
lips to
thanks so much,
God's
Vince.
ears.
Yeah,
Awesome,
yeah. Thank you so much for joining us, Vince.
It was my
appreciate it.
pleasure, I promise.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, from
All right.
the Rockies of Colorado to the banks of the Missouri, thanks to all the listeners from points in between and not in between. Until next time, he's John and I'm Adam. Stay classy, Frostburg.